Hello, everybody. Welcome to Your Cult Boyfriend. This is Jay from Style of Substance, and here we have special guest Jacob.
Jacob from Twitter is my usual introduction,
All right. Um,
which is funny
so
because I'm not on Twitter.
yeah, yeah, but that's yeah. Um, so today we're going to be speaking about two different films, those being Halloween and Halloween 2, by Rob Zombie. Um, why don't you kind of like introduce these movies to the audience?
Me?
Yeah.
Okay, I can. Okay, so I mean, should I give background? So I feel like most people already know. The deal here is that Rob Zombie was brought in by the Weinsteins to make a remake of Halloween. It was beset by production woes. Finally got out. Everyone hated it. He made a second one, also beset by production woes, and everyone hated it. But in, I'd say, maybe the past 5 or 6 years, both of them have undergone a pretty massive critical reappraisal, to the point that for a lot of people, it's almost better than the originals, or at least some of the most interesting horror movies of recent memory.
So
Uh,
I'm not somebody that typically likes remakes more than the originals. But
yeah.
actually in this case, I'm not. It's been a while since, so maybe my opinion will change. But I'm not really the biggest fan of John Carpenter's Halloween, and I haven't seen the sequel to that movie. But I do quite like Rob Zombie's Halloween and Halloween 2, especially the second one. But the first one, even rewatching that this year, I thought it's a lot better than I remembered it being. What do you think of them?
Yeah, I'm probably more attached to the original John Carpenter movie.
Hmm.
I think I've actually mentioned it on this channel before. I have like kind of a reading of it as being a remake of a Lovecraft story,
Mm.
um, the Dunwich Horror. But I'm definitely more emotionally attached to the Rob Zombie movies. I don't know. Part of it is because my favorite Carpenter movies were always other ones, like in The Mouth of Madness and Prince of Darkness and The Thing. Whereas this one, I saw it and it was just immediate personal guttural reaction. Even early on, because I saw them early on when I was told by everyone that they were bad. And so I
Hmm.
was like, yeah, they're probably bad because that was like when I was younger. I think it was around the time I graduated high school. But they like stuck in my head, and I think part of the reason is because my earliest exposure to horror movies was this style, because I grew up primarily in the 2000s, and so I was exposed to, like, I think one of the first slasher I ever saw was the Prom Night remake. So I'm very attached to this style, this kind of, the whole post 9/11 torture, hyper violent, gruesome slasher movie. It's a genre I think I take more seriously than other people, just because it's very visceral for me, whereas for other people I think they find it kind of laughable or over the top. I find it kind of very like,
So, I know some people kind of find it to be in bad taste, and we'll probably get into that in a moment. But
yeah, I don't know.
um,
I'll definitely get into it for at least Halloween 1, but it's a style that for me I think triggers a lot of empathetic reaction from me that I don't get from other kinds of slasher
well,
movies.
I think like, and I'm not like a Rob Zombie mega fan or anything, but like I do think that even within like his body of work, I definitely think that he appeals to the pathos in many ways.
Yeah.
Especially like the ending of The Devil's Rejects with
Yeah,
Freebird.
which
That's the best
might
use of
be my
Freebird in any
favorite.
film. What's that?
Yeah, that might be my favorite Rob Zombie movie, which is actually probably the most conventional take I have about Rob Zombie. It's one I'm very
Yeah,
attached
I
to.
think that one's
But
pretty. That's fairly well liked.
I mean,
The Halloween films really aren't. Well, I guess maybe now they sort of. There's at least like some horror
I
fans and
mean, we say that, but I feel like most of the people that watch this video will probably be completely unaware. It's one of those things where it's just like there's a specific sector of the internet
yeah.
where like a few hundred people, give or take, have completely reclaimed these movies in the past few years, and Rob Zombie at large. Although I say this, but I talk to people I know in like who are fans of horror movies who, because they're fans of horror movies, they're obviously familiar with Rob Zombie, either via his music and movies or both. But a lot of them are like, yeah, he seems like a nice guy, like he means well. I just don't like his movies. But I don't know. It's so there's not like this vitriol against him, like people kind of compared to like say like Uwe or like other like kind of unanimously hated directors. Rob Zombie, everyone's kind of like, no, he seems like a nice guy who has like a clear vision that's distinct from other people, but it just doesn't vibe with a lot of people for
It,
some reason
and
until
I think
recently.
with the Halloween films, there's like a fandom that's kind of like that surrounds them, and like they don't really like how he characterized like Michael Myers, for
Oh,
example.
yeah, he completely
Um,
shifts the mythology. Every single aspect of the
he,
mythology he
he,
changes.
he does. And personally, as somebody that was not really a fan of the original, and maybe I'll change my mind on rewatch, but who wasn't really a fan of the original, I thought he made Michael Myers actually interesting because I thought that Michael Myers was kind of like uh, based off of that first movie, I did not care for him. But like the way that Rob Zombie reinterpreted him, I thought it was quite an interesting like direction. But maybe that like it just ticked off so many fans. So, but
It makes sense because he completely took the material and then rewrote its the themes of the franchise. He completely shifted to fit his own interest because John Carpenter is interested in like cosmic horror and pessimism and in nihilism, and then Rob Zombie is interested in Americana and social outcasts,
well,
and most importantly, like the mythology surrounding American serial killers. Like Rob Zombie has like a long-standing like fascination with Manson, and
hmm,
Manson shows up like all over his work. Like
I could see
Devil's
it.
Rejects is practically an homage, like a move is practically about the Manson family.
I can see it.
You constantly see his face throughout his work, even in his live performances, his music. He uses like Manson imagery a lot in his performances. So it's like something he has like a fascination with. This is a very explicit, I think, and also the Three from Hell. But
Hmm.
so he tackles that because like you actually see that with Halloween. I'll just call it Halloween '07 for convenience.
Okay.
Um, Halloween '07 is in its own way, and I think both of the movies kind of engage with it, but Halloween '07 is kind of its own engagement with like true crime and people that are kind of obsessed with serial killer lore and mythos and shit like that. It shows up with what's his name? Loomis. Uh
Well, they make it really much into that movie, Oedipal complex,
yeah,
serial killer, right?
he explicitly even name drops Freud in two.
Yeah, he does. And the kind of like synthesizes the main points. But I don't know. I'm just kind of a sucker for that stuff, honestly.
I mean,
Um,
it's horror, so I feel like you can't escape psychoanalysis. Although it kind of escapes Freud in a few places. Maybe I'm just saying that because I've been reading Jung recently, but
mhm.
well, I'll get to that with Halloween too. We should stick to Halloween one for the
Yeah,
moment.
let's talk about Halloween one from 2007. So
So,
the one thing that I would like to actually start with the criticisms and kind of like pick your brain about one thing. I think it's a great movie, but do you think that there's some legitimacy to kind of like criticizing the aesthetic on the basis of it's trying to be like kind of like white trash suburbia, but it uses like it's a big budget movie though, but it's a kind of like artificial poverty in a
yeah,
way. What do you think about that?
I I mean, my initial thing is that and again, this is obviously like a Weinstein production through and through. They're meddling is well documented by Rob himself, who complained about it to no end. Um, but I also feel like Rob Zombie is kind of inherently the opposite of corporate, and maybe that's partly influences because like Rob is constantly trying to keep an era alive that's been dead since the '80s.
Hmm.
Like he takes influence from like Toby Hooper and like Jalo filmmakers and people that made movies like what do you call it, Tourist Trap and shit like that. And then obviously like the Universal monsters and like old stuff, but like he's mostly like style wise imitating like the '70s and '80s, which is a thing that doesn't really exist anymore. Like that kind of style, horror doesn't exist like that anymore. Horror is not a fringe thing anymore. Horror is very like mainstream now. It's very mainstream. You know, your big name auteurs right now are like James Wan and Mike Flanagan. And like those are the guys that make money from doing horror. And it's a very like clean, pristine horror. And I feel like Rob Zombie is like very much against that. Although I say that, but like Halloween, this one is actually the one that I think is the most mainstream feeling movie he ever made in a lot of
Yeah,
ways. But as to
I can see that, but I guess like you
I
say
see
that
what you
you say he's like kind of like anti-corporate, and I think like by virtue of I guess butchering Michael Myers and that whole lore, I think that hey, I'm okay with throwing that wrench into the machine, you know?
yeah, and I should clarify when I say anti-horror, because obviously again, this is like a studio production. I mean
Hmm,
mostly in terms of like how well it will be received by the mainstream, because
hmm,
again, this is the
yeah,
usual mainstream movie is one that wants to give people kind of like an amusement park ride, which I think is actually kind of well parodied in his first movie, A House of a Thousand Corpses, because the beginning of the movie
yeah,
is a bunch of like white suburbanites who come to the Hicks, and then they go on this, you know, funhouse ride, and it's at their expense and they all die for it, which I think is a pretty good metaphor. But in the case of Halloween, yes, it's a studio product, but it's also a studio product that spends like at least 50 minutes of its runtime dedicated to poor people in like rural Illinois screaming at each other,
yeah.
and a kid who has like numerous like developmental problems, mental health issues, who commits murder, like murders a bully. And it's like when I watched it this time, I forgot. I should have remembered, because I watched this for the first time maybe 5 years ago, and it made me feel miserable then, and I forgot. And when I watched
Yeah.
it again, I felt miserable. And I say that like Halloween 2 is a sad movie. Like Halloween 2 is a movie that makes me feel like very sad, and it hits me in a very personal way. This movie, Halloween '07, just like makes me feel miserable, like to the point that like I actually have to skip parts of it because it makes me feel like shit.
Are
Which
you meaning
is,
like especially kind of like towards the beginning?
yeah, mostly the first hour. Although once a lot, some of the murders in the second half really depress me and hit me
Well,
hard. Mostly like
I,
Laurie's parents,
I
but
think like Zombie does make like some like visceral films, you know, and I think that
yeah,
this is definitely a prime example of that, as mainstream as it may be. Um, but I guess like
there's no like theatricality to it, about to like the suffering in Rob Zombie, because like I feel like a
well,
lot of for example, like any other, I think like mainstream horror of the late 2000s or 2010s, I'll say, would have like a lot of melodrama or like interpersonal
well,
drama that's very like well telegraphed, whereas like Rob Zombie, it's just people screaming at each other
well,
and they hate each
I still
other.
think that there's probably some element of melodrama in there.
Oh, absolutely, it's
But he
incredibly like
does like
melodramatic, at
the
least the
way that
first
he
act.
gets into the arguments are almost like comically like exaggerated, but at the same time it's like, well, if you're in that situation, people are in those situations, and it's like it, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the way that it differs from Carpenter, especially that opening, which is the best part of Carpenter's film in my opinion, um like Zombie, he spends time like with Michael. It's almost like it's not. I don't think he's like trying to explain. Well, hey, maybe Michael's actually good, but it's like you have a better understanding of why he's doing these killings, right? Because it's like
Yeah, they
his father-in-law or sorry, not in-law, his stepfather
it's
or
like a
whatever he is.
stepfather
Yeah,
figure of some kind.
he sucks. He's
The
terrible.
movies the movies make a point. In fact, both movies I think may make a point of addressing this, because at points I think in both of them the nature nurture thing is brought up, and in both cases says something to the effect of it's both. I think he says specifically like he was the perfect
Yes.
like violent cocktail of like born with all the worst possible mental health issues, and psychological factors mixed with a horrible home environment.
Yes, I think that's what he's basically saying is like you can't really pinpoint like
There's a
these kind of
randomness to it.
right. There is a randomness to it, but then also it's like you can't just like be so reductive and say like, oh yeah, this is because of so and so. This is because of so and
Yeah.
so. Instead, it's like, well, it's a mix of it, right? It is nurture and it's also
Yeah.
nature, and that's how it is with a lot of people. Like, and I think that he does a good job, like maybe kind of like I don't know. Would you say it's maybe almost a call to empathy towards Michael in some ways, at least when he's
I
younger?
do. I
Okay.
do. Because I think what the ultimate nutshell of like the nature nurture thing is like you can say like yes, Michael was molded because he had a horrible home environment and it treated him like shit, and he had all these like psychological factors that fucked him up. And but like what it comes down to in both cases is like completely random for Michael. Like Michael didn't choose this. He was just like born fucked up around fucked up people, and like it was purely random, which is I think like again like it's something that I think Rob pulls from Toby Hooper, which is like this kind of like nihilist randomness. Because like
Mhm.
the whole premise of Texas Chainsaw is that it's just a bad day, where it's like everything that could possibly go wrong in one day went wrong.
It's like
Is the
Murphy's
premise?
Law. It's like Murphy's Law,
Yeah,
like rolled up into
that's
one day.
Texas Chainsaw. Because
Mhm.
Texas Chainsaw, the whole like six, like five kids, 5 or 6 kids, just go accident happen to go to this one place this one time, and then they all die.
You're talking about
Uh,
Toby Hooper's original, right? Texas Chainsaw
yeah,
Massacre.
yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, and I think that's the premise of a lot of Rob Zombie. You see it in Devil's Rejects because Devil's Rejects, it's like every person that dies, it's kind of they make a point of showing how they only ended up in that situation purely by chance, and they almost didn't. Like a person almost doesn't go to a certain place, but they decide to, and then they instantly die. And so there's this randomness where like people just kind of suffer randomly and incoherently, and there's no kind of rhyme or reason to it. And I think that's what happens to Michael in these movies is they just show how Michael just kind of suffered and was born to be this way in kind of a random horrible way. And I think a lot of the second half is him exerting power, like reacting by trying to exert power over the world.
Yes. And I don't think it's like asking you to like agree with him. It's just kind of more like an asking you
No.
to try to understand to some extent, or like at least attempt to try to understand like the roots. And that kind of goes into like our fast like culture's kind of like fascination with like serial killers and like these like villainous figures in
Yeah, because
society within
people,
history. And I think Loomis, yeah, I think he's a bit different in the second one, but in this first one, I think like he actually is trying to help Michael, right? At least it seems so.
yeah, I mean, they imply he's kind of a dick because he
Yes.
writes a book about it. He does write a book about Michael and gets it published, so he's kind of exploiting him. But
Well,
also, he
I'm
does
thinking about
clarify
more
that
in the
he
first one
was.
though. More in the first one, I think he's is trying to help him, right?
Yeah, no, no, he is because he's like he calls himself like the last of a long series of father figures.
Well,
For Michael, he was like the only That's why you have the shot at the whole. That's why the finale of Halloween 2 is like the family is reunited. You have
yes.
the father, the mother, the 2 kids, which of course Loomis never met Laurie until the second one, but nonetheless, it's like he's the father, like for all intents and
I thought he
purposes, he's
met
the
her.
closest
Didn't
thing.
he meet her briefly in the first one?
He
Or
at
towards
the
the end?
end.
Yeah, yeah, at the end.
Yeah,
Yeah, okay.
yeah. I meant like before
Yeah,
the
right.
murders,
Okay,
like as
right.
a child.
Okay,
But
okay, yeah. I see what you mean.
yeah, no, it's very much because again, these movies are obsessed with family. Michael's obsessed with his mother, which is I think actually really interesting because and this shows a lot of like the kinds of people Rob Zombie has respect for or kind of respects the dignity of is that Michael's mom is a stripper,
Yeah.
and she lives in poverty with like an abusive husband, and she is treated throughout the first film as an absolute paragon of goodness. She is like in life even before she becomes like this spirit haunting
Well, yeah,
him.
even when like Love Hurts first plays at the begin
Yeah,
towards the beginning of the first movie, like, Michael's kind of sitting like alone in like sort of isolation, and it cuts to her like, pole dancing, if I remember right. And it's like, it's almost like the way it's shot, it's almost framing her as like, she's
Angelic.
dancing like an angel. Yes. And then like when Love Hurts reprises in the second one, once again, she's pretty much acts as an angel or a Grim Reaper or whatever.
Yeah, yeah. She's
But
like the only good person in this world. And so you kind of get Michael's
well,
anger
at least
when
in the
she's
first one.
lost. Yeah, because well, the in Halloween 2, she's more a projection of what Michael wants, although I have a lot of feelings about that.
Well, yeah, yeah,
But
but that's what he wants. Okay, because okay, I think obviously there is
we'll get
like,
to that. We'll
but
get to
in the
that.
context of the first one, thinking about like kind of the Oedipal complex, I guess like,
Yeah.
I know some people may just watch horror movies, just watch it and not even think about this kind of thing, but like it's pretty obvious in some ways because it's like, he kills like his stepfather, right? And then it's like he obviously wants to, in some ways, be with his mom, right? Um,
Yeah. He
and
wants to
then
revert
and
to
then that
like
kind of
his
manifests also with his sister, briefly. But then it's
yeah.
like, but he's not really like, he's not sexually developed to that point too much. But then also like, there's just this element of something getting in his way too. And then like he supplements like his not just violent urges but also sexual urges with violence.
Yeah.
Um, and he, it's like, and you see that kind of manifest throughout the course of this film, and that's why I think like when he starts like, years later after he escapes from prison, and or I guess like the mental institute, I can't remember
Hospital,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. He basically, when he starts stalking like these girls and ends up killing them. What I find really interesting about that is that, like, I remember watching that with the Carpenter's film, and I just didn't really care. When I'm watching it now, it's like, oh, I'm understanding this character, because before I just thought Michael was just boring, but I think the zombie makes him interesting. And I
Yeah.
get,
I
I
mean,
get the appeal of Michael Myers is almost like he is a mystery. Nobody knows why he does it. It's like zombie kind of maintains some of that, but it's like I think like by kind of like recognizing him as human first. Well, yes, but then he also turns him into kind of like this demigod. So
yeah.
it's kind of he humanizes,
I
but at any rate, he humanizes him in some ways. Not to say that
yeah.
he like glorifies him, but he humanizes him, and that's what I find very interesting about it. Because when he starts stalking the girl, it's like, oh, you can kind of, you don't just see things like through his mask, like towards the beginning. Now you're actually getting inside his head, just like
Yeah.
Loomis was trying to get inside his head, and just like people kind of respond to true crime and so on and so forth,
Mhm.
right? And
Yeah.
but it's like, oh, now I know what Michael's thinking. And I think it's healthier personally to try to get in, understand that mindset from kind of a fictional character. When it comes to like sensationalizing real events, it gets a little more foggy for me.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know.
Not to say
As
you can't be studied or it shouldn't be studied, but it's just kind of like,
oh
y
no,
y
like I said, I think he's trying to engage with like the kind of toxic, parasitic
yeah,
aspects of like true crime culture
yeah,
because for a
but
lot of
doesn't he
true
kind of like also just engage with that too, though?
well, I mean,
Like in terms
yeah,
of,
he does because he's fascinated by it. It's Rob Zombie is just perpetually fascinated by like the freaks of the world. Like one of his favorite movies is Todd Browning's Freaks, which is
not,
a
I
movie
am not
about a
surprised by
bunch
that one bit.
yeah, it's about a bunch of like circus
Yeah,
freaks
a great movie.
who rise up and
Yeah.
kill the normal people, and it's
That's a sad
fantastic.
movie too. I like
It's
it.
incredibly sad, and I think that's what Rob taps into because I think like a lot of people, a lot of Americans, he has like that morbid fascination, as anyone does, because I think that's kind of a natural inclination to like be fascinated by the societal others. But I think what like makes Rob different is that he also wants them to have some degree of dignity as others. I think like the apex of that is still Devil's Rejects, how like he not to keep going back to Texas Chainsaw, but he's just so connected to Texas Chainsaw. There's a
I think you see it in this movie also in Halloween one.
yeah, Toby Hooper thought of Texas Chainsaw as a comedy, and I think I've talked about this before. He references the part where like two teenagers have just been murdered, and by Leatherface, and Leatherface's brother comes back, and he sees the bodies on the floor. He realizes Leatherface just like killed a bunch of people, and he's like, "You broke the fucking door, you dumbass!" And he just starts yelling at him because his little brother broke the door. And Leatherface is like cowering because he knows he's in trouble. And it's like funny because they're acting like normal people in a ridiculous situation. And you get that like in Devil's Rejects, where like they're a family of serial killers, like murderers who have killed like dozens and dozens of people, and they're fighting in their car about whether or not they're going to stop for ice cream. And it's shit like that that I think is like what marks Rob Zombie's feelings towards others. So he does kind of exploit, he does kind of like revel in like the mythology of like, how was Michael Myers born, in the same way people like think like, how did Ted Bundy come to be? How did Ed Gein come to be?
Yeah.
But he's also like more interested in like empathizing with Michael as like a kid who also just happens to be hurting and feeling like very alone and doesn't, very isolated from the world,
There's
to the
something
point
that,
that the only person he has a connection with is his mother. And then his
well,
mother's
there, no,
gone. He
there,
has nothing
there
left.
is with Lori though,
Yeah, I
right?
mean, like an emotional connection as a child. The only connection he has is with his mother, and then she
No,
dies, and
I
so he.
disagree. I think that
Oh
he still
yeah.
has
Oh, you're
emotional.
talking about like when he's like attached to her as a baby. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yes, yeah, yeah, and I
yeah.
think that carries on. It's almost like this is like the new manifestation of his mother, like, or at least the closest thing.
Yeah, he's trying to rebuild his family because he wants to go back home. Because when he's in the hospital, he just keeps saying like, I just want to go home. Can you please
Well,
take
yeah,
me
but does
home?"
he
And
want
then
to rebuild his
guess
family?
where he goes? He immediately goes home. He breaks out of the hospital and
He goes to the
immediately gets
original house,
exiled at
yeah.
home.
But,
Yeah, he goes home
okay,
because he
but does
wants
he
to
really
rebuild
want to
his
rebuild his
family.
family, or does he want to end it?
He wants to build an idealized family.
Right. Hmm.
He wants to like make a family that will live forever.
What? So does he want
Um,
to? Okay, and he accomplished that through death in
I
killing
don't.
their
It's
friends.
unclear what he has. This is actually why I think there's a line that addresses this um when Loomis goes to the cop, Annie's dad, played by Brad Dourif, and Brad Dourif says, "Well, what?" He says, "I think he's going for his sister." And Brad Dourif says, "Well, why? What is he going to do with her?" And the normal reaction I think would be to say to kill her, but Loomis says, "I don't know. Like I don't know what he wants to do with her, but I don't think it's good." And sure enough, when Michael gets her, he doesn't kill her. He kidnaps her. He tries to show her a picture. He tries to reveal to her that she's his sister, but she doesn't understand because he's not talking, and so she doesn't get it.
Well, I think it. Well, I don't. I think it's also like, are you this person? Do you remember me?
Yeah,
Kind of a
he's like
thing.
trying to
Yeah.
like convey to her. It reminds me, there's a cutscene in one of the Lego Star Wars games where they're trying to silently do the "I am your father" scene, and Darth Vader's just shoving a photograph of him with Padme and Anakin's or Luke's face.
Oh, right.
It's
Like, yeah, here's my pregnant wife, and we made
Yeah, and
you.
he's like, "This is you." That's what Michael is doing. But then she fights back, and so he does try to harm her, it seems like, but it's mostly like in self-defense or more in like a pacifying way, like he's trying to just like stop her from trying to run away. It's very unclear. It's also unclear if he wants to do like a suicide pact with her. We don't know. It's
Yeah, so
very
that was one thing I was trying to figure out when I was rewatching these movies, and at some point I just gave up.
I think it's just one of those things that only makes sense to Michael. He just has this like compulsion towards her. I don't think he really knows what he
Well, no,
wants to
well,
accomplish.
I think the second one kind of legitimizes kind of like the super. Well, we'll get into that, but it
Yeah,
kind of like shows like
yeah.
this, like maybe he's building like this weird cult thing. Okay, but you say about how like he's just hurting inside, and one thing I find interesting is Lori grows up in a good
Super
household.
white neighborhood, like
She grows up in a conventionally like idealistic household in some
yeah,
ways.
like
She's
comfortably middle class,
Yeah,
comfortably
yeah,
middle
she's comfortably
class.
middle class. She's happy and she goofs around. The worst thing that in the world is like boys
Sex jokes
and the
to her
grades and
mom.
stuff.
Yeah.
Or no, even that she's like good and just she's like I'm gonna babysit. And then she's just like she's like a
Yeah, she's
typical like what 16, 17 year old and she just
it's actually kind of, I find that kind of interesting because it's like Michael kind of
saved her.
Well, my reading of the original Halloween is again that it's like a Dunwich horror thing about like suburbia being self-immolated. Like this monster comes to murder white suburbia, and the
Mm,
the monster was born in white suburbia. The monster is
yes,
white suburbia,
but
and like he's coming to eat it alive. But this time it's different because Michael comes from outside of that. Michael is the quote unquote white trash.
mm,
But it's interesting because
I
Laurie,
see what
that's
you're
where Laurie
saying.
was born. Laurie was born there, but then she was raised in this other world, and it's like Michael wants her to know where she came from. Like she like it's like this weird like she had like he it's kind of reminds me of Lovecraft in this kind of like fear of blood and like fear of like human origins, which in Lovecraft was a very racist thing. In this, it's
Right.
kind of more toned down. It's more just like he's like, you can't escape this. Like this is who you are. This is like she lived in this fantasy world, and Michael's like, no, like this surrounding you with corpses. This is where you come from. This is like your
But at the same
family.
time, Michael, if you think about it in this perspective,
Mhm.
Michael, by killing like the family, and then like the mother committed suicide, so it's indirect. But
Yeah,
by the death
he
of the
murders his
family,
family
it
because
saved
it's not good
her.
enough.
It saved
Yeah.
her.
Yeah, they kind of like flitter through how Lori got out. I think they say Brad Dourif says that he like found her and kind of passed her along to an orphanage or something,
Well,
and
yeah.
it was purely by chance
Well,
that she ended
he
up
thought it
back
was
in
so
heaven.
horrific that he didn't want like the baby to
Her to grow
know.
up around the stigma,
Well, yeah. So he took her
because who
nearby.
wants to be the sister of Michael Myers?
So he took her
Yeah.
nearby to somebody that would adopt. And then kind of kept an eye on her as she, grew up. And I find that fascinating, because in a lot of ways, like what brings on this trauma, is Michael Myers, but in a lot of ways that he actually saved her from growing up in that environment. Which I
That's
find, what I find really interesting about it.
I mean, she seemed pretty stable in it.
Well,
It's
no,
more, I
no,
feel
that's
like the
that's what I'm.
worst you can say is that it's like very superficial,
Well,
is that they're very
yes,
like cut
yes,
off from
yes,
reality.
and then it's not till the second one that she really kind of becomes more fleshed out because she like has this response. But in that first one, what I'm saying is this, you know, her childhood is fine,
Yeah.
preserved. Imagine what Lori would be like if she grew up with that man as her, father.
Yeah, exactly. Oh,
It
I see what
would
you're saying. Yeah, I thought you meant like he was saving her like at the end of the movie when he kills
no,
all
no,
her
no,
friends.
no, no, no,
No. Okay. Okay. No,
no.
no, I see what you mean. I see what you mean. Yeah, yes, I agree. I
No,
agree.
no, he
He was
basically
kind of
saved. And now that
he
she's
was
reaching adulthood, now she's realizing that, oh, this is where I come from, and oh, this is really, really messed up.
yeah, it's horrifying. It's like it reminds me of speaking of like true crime type shit, like it reminds me of like how like BTK serial killer was like a family man. He was like a dad, and he like raised his daughter for like 16 years or something before she found out her dad was a serial killer and shit like that. It's kind of like this fantasy. It's like a Blue Velvet thing, like this kind
Yeah.
of evil
Well, yeah, it's
underneath.
kind of
Like,
like this superficial, like suburban, like town, and then it's like this is
yeah,
what lies
ideality.
beneath. These
Although
beetles are eating each other alive, that kind of thing, right?
we yeah, although we say that, but I do admire how like and I feel like people hate this about Rob because they think it's kind of cringy or something, but like I love Rob's like dialogue. I love how
I don't have any problem,
Rob
honestly.
tries to write people as like talking like normal fucking people. I don't know. I feel like the way that say like Lori and her friends talk is a way that feels like very normal
Yeah,
to
that
like
felt
how
that
I see
honestly felt
people talk.
organic, like the
It's
way that they
incredibly
talk.
organic. I genuinely think it's like some of the most organic dialogue I've ever
And it's
seen.
juxtaposed from like him being raised what in the 90s or something, or 80s.
Rob.
No, 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 no.
Oh,
Michael when
Michael.
he's a kid.
Yeah,
The
I would
environment
say
that
like the
he's around is very different
90s.
than how what she's around, and in a lot of ways, it's saying that no, like this is acknowledging the privilege that people of upper class like have, right? and it's like, yeah, it is a better quality of life in many ways, but like,
It's a different it's a different take on it though, because it's different from like the David Lynch thing, whereas like the David Lynch thing is like this ideality is like utopian. Like
yeah.
in Lynch, you see like perfect neighborhoods, like Laura Palmer was a perfect, happy girl in a perfect home and all that. And then the evil comes out
And
and
then you
tears
start
it apart.
realizing like the darkness beneath, right?
Yeah, but
The
this is different.
it's the Beatles that
This
are
is a
eating each
bit
other,
more.
right?
Yeah, but yeah, exactly. This is a bit more sober though. Like Rob is like, no, it's not like utopian, but it's normal. It's
Right.
normal.
Well,
It's
it's the
calm.
normal life
It's
that Michael wishes he had.
non-confrontational.
It's the
Yeah,
normal.
it's very non-confrontational. It's what Michael wanted. Yeah, free of antagonisms, free of like people fighting and people unhappy and shit
So
like that.
I understand when it comes to the family, but what about like the friends that he goes after, the girls that he kills? Like, what's up with that?
This is, I think he's just afraid of girls. I don't know.
Well, I
They
think it's like
mostly
people that
clarify.
I think it's people that are connected, and I don't like to Lori. Um,
Some of them are random. Like one of her friends gets killed, but only because she's in Michael's house. And
yeah,
so like she's in Michael's house and Michael wants to use the house. And so although he does kind of use her for semi-ritualistic purposes, which is something that's kind of expanded on in the second one, where like in the second one it's implied that like it's a ritual murders, like which is the most Manson shit ever. Like he really leans into the Manson shit in Halloween 2 because it's like ritual killings. But in Halloween 1, there's only the one, and it seems kind of incidental, which is her friend with her boyfriend having sex
well,
in the
I think part
Myers
of that
house.
is like this kind of like I wouldn't say asexual, but anti-sexual nature about him.
Yeah, which is obviously a long running thing about like the supposed like conservatism of slasher movies, that like the girls that have sex get killed. I think this is slightly different though. I think this
It's
is a
slightly
bit
different because you're getting it from his perspective. It's obviously wrong.
it's
Like,
more Freudian here, which again, like the Freud shit. It's
it's not saying that, oh,
because
hey, they deserve it more, except maybe the stepdad in the
well
beginning.
because like the mythos of like Friday the 13th is that Jason became who he is because the camp counselors were having sex. And so because they were neglectful, and so now he's this venging spirit who's like killing hedonistic teenagers for being irresponsible, which is like very conservative. Whereas here it feels more like Michael just doesn't understand sex and it kind of scares him.
Part of it's that,
And
like he
he
entered
wants
kind
to
of,
revert to
he never,
childhood.
well, he never went past that Oedipal like development in a Freudian
Yeah,
way.
he doesn't want to live in a world where sex exists because that's horrifying. He
Yes,
wants to become a child again.
yes, but
He
at the
wants to
same time,
be
I still think that some of his like crimes are sexual motivated, like within that
sexually
first.
coded.
Yes.
It's
Well, I mean, come on, like it's almost just like, oh, I want, but it's almost like his version of sex is
yeah, it's
the
the
knife.
phallus
Yeah,
thing. Yeah, which lots of movies. No, my
and
favorite is
like
Texas Chainsaw
Annie
2.
gets
But yeah,
butchered.
yeah,
Annie
she
gets
gets
butchered,
butchered.
and it's like, and she's like, and um, talk about that one criticism we mentioned before. Um,
Which one?
oh, but the fact that like, what doesn't the person that played Annie like play in some of the movies beforehand?
Yeah, the actress who plays Annie is, I think, in Halloween 4 and 5. I haven't seen those two. I've only seen the first three, but I think she's in those ones. She's like a carryover, which probably is why she survives the first one.
Hmm.
Is because she's like, I don't know if she's a fan favorite because again, I haven't seen those movies or something, but I assume she's one that like Rob attaches some importance to, so he
Well,
wanted her to
so
live.
I guess the
But it's
criticism.
still she's brutalized.
Yeah, so the
But
criticism that I heard is that basically it kind of like sexualizes kind of like um
a former kid that was in
a
these
former
movies.
child, which is weird, which I guess is weird, but I never watched this movie, so I never really thought about that.
I
Um,
mean, she is sexualized, but only to the extent that she's a teenager who wants to have sex, and so she has sex, which is, I don't think, gratuitous. I think that's kind of just like
well,
she's
but there is kind
17.
of like, don't you think there is kind of a level of like sleazy gratuity within like the
Yeah,
nudity,
and this is
especially in this first
normally
one?
Yeah, normally I don't actually think Rob crosses the line, and I say that as like a fan of Devil's Rejects. Devil's Rejects, like a lot of the shit that like the main characters did to like people,
Yeah.
specifically women in the Devil's Rejects, and it's horrifying. And I don't think he crossed a line there. I do think he kind of crossed a line with one scene of this, which is the scene of like Michael's escape. Although I
Oh,
say that, but for the record, that's only in the director's cut.
well, but
Um,
that's his cut, and that's what we're gonna talk about now.
well,
That's
I don't
I don't
actually
mind it.
know. I don't know. Well, I say this more because like I know sometimes like something is called the director's cut, but it's the director didn't really do it.
Well, I know
So
that like
I'm going to assume it's his, and also it's the most widely available version of the movie,
well,
so it's the only one I've ever seen.
yeah,
But
that's what I saw. I don't really have an issue with that. I know, I mean, I get that people are sensitive. Well, I mean, I guess if you look at some of my videos, I actually put some insensitive subject or sensitive
yeah,
subject
I
matter
mean,
rather.
it bothered me. It bothered me to the point that like I skipped through it on this viewing. I
Well,
thought it was unnecessary,
it's
but
uncomfortable, um, arguably unnecessary because like especially considering it could be dropped because it was dropped for
yeah.
theatrical and it didn't really change the overall story that much. And in that sense, I could see how people consider it trivialized sexual like assault.
Yeah, yeah. I and which is interesting because in Devil's Rejects it's also kind of trivialized, but in kind of like a very
Well, in that sense, it's like
reflexive way, a very reflexive way where like the point
to
is that like
some extent, I don't know.
well, I mean like the dialogue takes it lightly, but that's because the people in question saying this are analogs to Charles Manson. So like obviously they don't take it seriously, and I think that's deliberate on his part in those movies, whereas sorry, this it feels more like actual, just like what if something
Yeah,
fucked up happened.
but also
This sounds
like,
fucked
but in
up.
that sense, like that scene, it's like Michael almost plays the hero.
That's the other weird part, because he also is like the symbol for brutalizing women throughout the movie. So I
It's
don't
weird that he
know.
saves. Well, but maybe there's kind of like this affinity towards people um that are in similar positions as him instead of people that are kind of like
Yeah, I
above
can
him
see that.
socially.
I can see
Do
that.
you know what I'm
Although we
saying? Where it's
say
almost
that,
like what's it's like people that are like maybe he hates like authority figures or people of like of the higher class, but this is another mentally unstable person that's like in the hospital seeking having treatment.
we say that, but the one character who is ever kind to him, he also kills.
Oh,
Who's
Danny
played by
Trejo's character. Was it
yeah,
Danny
Danny
Trejo?
Trejo. Thank you,
Mhm.
Danny Trejo, who's the who where he says, I was good to you, Mikey. I
Well,
was
yeah,
good to you,
I was just
which
about
is
to
one of my
think.
favorite lines in the movie
I
because
was
like I
just
feel like
thinking
that's a good
about that.
summation because
I was just
he
thinking
can,
about that, and I'm kind of thinking that even
Michael just
that
doesn't give a shit.
he's still in a position, a job position relative to Michael, where he kind of well, he's still in a, of authority, relatively speaking, like
Yeah,
to him.
yeah, I know what
And
you
in
mean.
that
I know what you
sense, I
mean.
still he lashes out at him, and I get that.
Hmm.
Um, it's definitely cold, right? Like that scene. Like
Yeah.
it's cold hearted. Don't get me wrong. I mean, like Michael Myers is not somebody to aspire to be. I'm not trying to,
No.
but obviously, but I do think that like within this like film there is some level of
Empathy
like
for him.
what's that?
Empathy for him.
Yeah. And
Well,
but I think in that moment when he kills Trejo, it's well, I think what it's doing there actually when he kills Trejo, it's kind of showing that like, oh, Michael is not somebody to trust. Like you don't necessarily. In some ways, he does leave some things up to chance. Like sometimes he spares people. You see that in the second one also. Uh,
yeah.
and
He also doesn't kill children, by the way, which is, I think, a recurring joke in these movies, in like all Halloween movies, is that frequently, like, Michael will be confronted with like a small child or an infant, and he just ignores them and walks away. The joke being that like the child has no idea that like they're like 2 feet from like a mass
so
murderer. Uh,
so the only kid that's like under like 16 at least, uh, that he killed
Which, to be fair, is
was
when
the
he's a
bully.
kid.
Was the bully
Yeah,
when
when
he was a
he's a
kid? Yeah.
kid. And he
Um.
doesn't do it again. He never does it again. He never kills children. So you see, he's a moral
Well,
man.
right, because he spares
But
Lori towards the beginning too, right? Like,
yeah, he spares Lori. I think one of the new ones also has a joke like that, where not joke, but like a bit like that, where he like the 2018 one. I think he like murders a woman and then he just like ignores her baby and walks away. But yeah, no, Michael. Part of it for me is that Michael throughout this movie and the next one, but mostly in this movie, actually, almost more than Halloween 2, mostly because Halloween 2 literalizes it. But in
mhm.
Halloween 1, he's like a giant child. He's like
Yeah,
he operates on like child
yeah.
thinking and child instinct.
Well, I still think he
And
kind of doesn't. Well, the second one, he's more like this boogeyman, but in a different
yeah,
way.
well, I say it literalizes it because like every time you see him, he has like like child Michael next to him, so it's like
Yeah.
literally a child is his brain,
Right.
but like
Well,
he never
yeah,
develops beyond
and
like
also his
12 years
mom.
old.
Before we move on to the second one, though, let's talk about Loomis just a little bit. Within
I love
the context
Loomis.
of this movie, what do you think of
Uh,
him?
Malcolm McDowell was perfect for it.
Yeah, he's great.
I do enjoy Donald Pleasance Loomis. I actually watched Halloween 2, like original Halloween 2 recently, and he's really funny in it because he seems like he's like a drunk spaz in every scene, but it's amazing.
McDowell's
But like
better.
Malcolm McDowell is really I don't know. He's this kind of guy who he feels like a really nuanced character that is both like really like deplorable, but
Well, within the first one, though, and I have something to say about this for the second one, but I think in the first one specifically, like just let for a moment, let's just pretend the second one doesn't exist. But the first
no,
one,
I'm speaking of even just the first one.
you
He's
think
like
so?
kind of a I mean, not maybe not deplorable, but just kind of like every other professional who says they want to help, and he's just like a career man who's like, but then he also obviously develops some degree of attachment for Michael because he becomes something of a father figure to him and like the only family he has for like 15 years. But
Um,
still, he like clearly exploits him constantly, and he also
okay.
does nothing. He clearly doesn't help him. He doesn't do anything for him, which maybe
I don't
isn't
know.
like
I feel like at least what you're supposed to think, and maybe this is just by reflection of what Michael thinks in the moment, during that year that he spent, working with him when he's in the mental hospital. I think I think you're supposed to think, at least at first, that he does want to help. It's not just, and he does have
oh
this
yeah,
attachment to
no,
him.
absolutely,
Hey,
I think
screw it.
so,
I'm going
but
to
I
talk about the
also think
second.
he just can't help him.
Screw it. I'm
Like
talking
there's
about the second one.
nothing.
We're talking about the second one
Oh,
now. Okay. In the
oh,
second one, Loomis, um, I would argue that his response to trauma, everybody responds to trauma in this one, at least in the director's cut. Don't watch the
mhm.
original cut.
It's so hard to at this point. It's
Yeah,
not even worth advising for people.
just
Like
don't. Right, like don't seek it out. Like it's pointless. It's the Weinsteins butchered it. Like
it's
they want to
really
take out
bad.
all the trauma.
This is like, to my knowledge, like Halloween '07, the differences between the theatrical and the director's cut are for the most part negligible. That one scene we talked about is like
Yeah.
one of the biggest changes. Otherwise, it's mostly just like dialogue changes, like slightly longer dialogue, slightly longer shots, slightly more stuff
Yeah,
going on
right.
during like the Loomis observing Michael
A little
years.
more violent.
Uh,
Yeah.
and Halloween 2 is literally a different movie. It's literally a different fucking movie. The entire emotional arc of the movie is different. It's some like Joss Whedon, Zack Snyder shit. Like it's a completely different movie.
Um,
Um,
but my point with Loomis, though, I know I agree with that, but at least within the director's cut, my point with Loomis is that, yeah, he is a total jerk, and like he's hardened, and he sensationalized everything within this book. Maybe it's important literature for it to exist in some form, but at the end of the day, I would actually argue that Loomis this is how he responds to trauma in some ways. Because
Yeah,
the
he wants to
event,
exert control. He
yes,
wants to.
and he does that through kind of like capitalistic means, right? In very sensationalist and very unethical means,
Yeah.
in bad taste. But I think
He's
that
like
like
completely shutting off his emotions from the world.
yes, but I think he was attached to Michael, and this is his how he responds to it in some ways.
Yeah.
In defense of him as a character, he's deplorable.
Yeah,
Maybe
no.
towards the very end, he's somewhat
Yeah, he makes
somewhat
this
redeemed,
sudden
but
shift to wanting to like
well,
redeem
it's when he
himself,
finds out that Michael's still alive. He's like, oh no, I'm
and he
cool with
feels guilty
sacrificing myself.
because he
Um,
put someone in danger. Yeah.
but I think that's kind of just more indicative of the fact that like he realizes that, oh, well, he's still alive. I must confront this. This is my responsibility. He's basically like my son in some ways, or
Yeah,
my patient, and I've
why
exploited him. So
which is I think a carryover from the original movies, because I think what's interesting about the original movies is that like Laurie isn't really the main characters of the movies. It's Loomis in the original movies, and I mean like the original series as a whole. Is that like it's about like Loomis, who like
yeah, but
despite
I
being
think
like a psychiatrist, it's his responsibility to
you
confront Michael.
compare Carpenter's Halloween, the first one, to Rob Zombie's two films. I think that Loomis is more interesting.
I mean more in like an archetypal sense, in the sense that
Yeah, no, I
like
get that. I get
the
that, but
broad stroke of the
they're
series.
all like in archetypical senses. I prefer these characters and how Zombie uses them.
No, I
Um,
know. I'm saying I think it's interesting that like the broad stroke of the series is that it is about the conflict between
right.
these two people and no one
Yes.
else. It's about Loomis and Michael
Yes.
and their relationship, and specifically as his relationship as a psychiatrist who is completely unable to help him because he's someone that cannot be helped.
Wouldn't that be a
And
psychologist,
or yeah, yeah.
right?
I don't know his professional
Right. Yeah, I think it'd
designation.
be a psychologist. Yeah. Um, Therapist. Regardless.
But yes, I agree. The this relationship is expounded upon in more detail in zombies films because he's more interested in like characterization, whereas Carpenter's original film was more interested in mechanics, and
Right.
then the sequels were more interested in mythology. So I
Some of them are
definitely
more
this
interested
one.
in money.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
So, just general. Okay, so that's kind of like my read on Loomis, but like a very kind of fascinating character. What about just the before we get into the other characters? What about just the movie in general? What are your main thoughts on it?
Halloween 2.
Yeah,
It's one of the most insane fucking movies ever made.
the masterpiece, right?
It's
It's a
fucking
masterpiece. It's a
insane.
great movie.
It's
Like
it's amazing.
it's
It's
like okay, structurally the way that it keeps having these twists and turns, and then like after this extended like dream, it's like or nightmare, I should say. It's it's about trauma. It's about responding to trauma, and it becomes surreal. It really
which
taps
I
into.
know is like, for the record, something of a meme right now, is that people saying X is quote unquote about trauma. But
Oh,
like
is it?
when it kind of, because now every new horror movie wants to say we're about trauma. Ari Aster says my new movie is about trauma, or I don't think he said that, but like it's kind of implicit in like
Oh,
Midsummer, and
okay.
like
Like you're talking about like Twitter discourse and stuff.
I'm talking about just in general, like directors talking about their movies.
Oh,
People like pitch movies now as being about trauma, which is kind of part of a trend, I think, in this kind of like indoctrination of horror into the mainstream to kind of like prove that it's more than what older horror movies more, like, oh, we're not like Friday the 13th. We're
well,
not,
but I think we're also
this
kind of in an
gratuitous
age where we're
shit.
trying to like empower people, especially like women and
We're
people of
trying to
color.
empower people, and we're trying to make things seem like they deserve respect. We're trying to prove that they deserve respect. But what's interesting about Rob Zombie is that he doesn't give a shit, because he makes movies. We're talking about a guy who makes movies or music, has made music since the 80s, in which he has a groove metal riff, and he goes, yeah, slamming my hooker bitch in the back of my vampire car, and like riding down in my Cadillac at 50 miles an hour, killing people, and like, which is part of his charm. But like, we're talking about like a guy like that, a guy who has a literal house with a Nightmare Before Christmas room. He doesn't care about mainstream respect. He doesn't
Well,
care
yes,
about like
and in some ways,
Roger Ebert giving
I
him
find
clout.
that in some ways I find that a bit more respect. Well,
It
there's some like
is.
there's some sensitivities that I think are worthy of criticism, but I think in some ways that can be more respectable than just being like trying to prove yourself. I rather
There's
that
no pontificating about it. There's
well,
no
well, there's no
insincerity.
there's no like dare I say virtue signaling or whatever, right? Like about like
Yeah,
one's own like self grandeur.
yeah. He makes some movies. He's like, I'm gonna make a movie in which like a dude got his life fucked up and now he just murders people, and
But,
that's my movie.
yeah, but
And
it's
like,
still
obviously,
but
there's more nuance to it,
yeah, there is.
but
It's like
like,
he just wants to make a good horror film, right?
he wants to just engage with like the narrative on its own terms and like see what's provoked of it. So I imagine, and this is obviously like he did this again. This is why I think you should watch Lords of Salem, because Lords of Salem is a movie about a recovering and relapsing drug addict, and how her life is just horrible. And that's just the starting point he goes from. Like he's like, all right, Laurie Strode, all her friends are dead, her parents are dead, her brother is a serial killer. How's she doing? I wonder how she's doing. And like he just confronts on like very blunt, like authentic terms. He doesn't try to I think the difference is that he doesn't try to think of this in like artistic terms. He doesn't try to think like, well, what's the thematic value of a person who all
I
their
don't
friends and family are
I
dead?
don't
He
know.
thinks he thinks of
I
this
don't
in
know if
terms
that's
of
true
like,
because the thematics are so on point, and as far as like
no,
the artistry, I don't know if I agree with that. What do you mean
no,
exactly?
no. When I say that, I don't mean he doesn't like consider themes or that themes are not present. What I mean is that like he's like, I think other directors treat like characters as means to ends,
Okay,
whereas he
yeah,
treats like
you treat
Laurie
them
as
as
like an
people.
end in herself.
Yeah,
Yeah, Laurie is not a means to explore what trauma means. Laurie is a person whose life got fucked, and he's interested
right.
in exploring that.
Okay,
He
okay,
doesn't care
I see
about
what you're
like the
saying.
idea. Yeah,
Right.
he's not treating her as like a character. He's treating her as like someone who's like, theoretically, this person's life got fucked up. What do they feel? What emotions do they
It's like what is
experience?
the natural trajectory from Halloween 1 to Halloween 2,
I
right?
mean, too, yeah, and he treats that in like very blunt, almost pragmatic terms. He kind of navigates that kind of
He
thinking.
does it so well.
He does it
He does it
really well
so
because her
well,
life sucks.
masterfully.
And there is something I think of like a really fun shift in Laurie's character, or maybe fun isn't the right word, but like noticeable shift,
Well, okay.
where like
The way I look at it, like if they're real people, it's different. Like talking about like fiction, like I think it can be fun. I think interesting things
no, I mean
and messed up
like
things can be fun in some ways.
it is kind of here because I was gonna say like in the first movie she's very like a sheltered suburban girl who's afraid to go on dates, and in the second one she has like hand tattoos and Alice Cooper posters and a
Well,
giant
she,
poster of
yes,
Manson on her bedroom
yes.
and shit like that. Like she goes through a mark shift, which to be fair makes sense because I think
But so
like
does
dark
Annie, though.
art, yeah, exactly. And I think like also for a lot of people like horror and dark art is a good like cathartic therapeutic mechanism
Yep.
and shit like that. Like people who have been through heavy shit like to gravitate to like heavy shit. I know
Well,
I
it's
do.
like,
Um,
yeah, it's as a means of processing, and that's the way I look at her. And I think that she does it. So, it's like that whole dynamic between her and like Annie. It's so good. It's like she's like trying to like she wants to get pills now, right?
she what?
She wants to get pills for her depression and like
Yeah, yeah.
and
She wants to be
PTSD.
medicated.
And once again, now she's having her own like therapist.
Yeah, because
Um,
this it's a nice like little Donnie
it's kind of like well,
Darkoism.
she's
Yeah,
starting to become like her. Now she's the one that's yelling, and kind of like making scenes and stuff. And
yeah. She
she
was confronted with like who she actually is, and without even realizing it, she kind of replicates where she came from.
right.
It's like it's actually kind of sad. So I don't know like how problematic it is on his part, but it's kind of like this, like she came from the quote unquote white trash, and no matter how hard they tried, like it's just part of her, which is like I don't know how true that is or
Well,
right that
well,
is, but
no,
it's
I mean,
interesting that that's what he evokes.
I mean, it's an idea. It's like a conceptual idea, and it's like, and just because a director is exploring these ideas doesn't necessarily mean that they themselves like completely agree with like the story that they're telling. That's the way I look at it, at least. With this thing, I think like sometimes like with both the first one and the second one, I think in some ways like the friends, within Laurie's like kind of circle are kind of an extension of her in some ways.
Yeah,
Um,
her
and
values.
in some ways, there's kind of like this like repetition of events, right? So like she's now kind of like the new manifestation of her mother into Michael's eyes, but also she's sort of becoming a new Michael.
Yeah,
Um, and this is kind of like it's almost like it's once again a call to empathy. And then like with her friends, right? Annie kind of starts voicing some things that are kind of like that's going through like her head, that's going through Laurie's head. And as she's becoming kind of like her brother in some ways, that's like she starts once after she like breaks down and finds out that like, oh, I am Michael Myers' sister, right?
yeah,
Um, and
and
I was gonna say like, and she's like, I don't care anymore. I'm partying. I'm
yeah,
gonna do drugs and drink and stuff. And her friend at the time is like dressed up as Rocky from
well,
Rocky Horror
all
Picture
three
Show.
of them are. They're dressed as Rocky Horror characters.
Are they all Rocky? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, all three are characters from Rocky Horror.
So
Yeah.
and I think that's kind of like shows kind of like this idea of I don't know how like conscious he was about this, but I think it's kind of like this idea of like the transition from like kind of like one person to like another, the kind of like becoming like a new character.
Yeah, because
And in
they're
some way,
all
like
like
I'm a
cross-dressers.
what was the line like?
I'm a
I'm a
girl who's dressed as a dude who wants to be a girl. Yeah.
yeah, something like that. Or
Yeah.
I'm a chick that wants to be a
I'm a chick who's dressed as a dude who wants to be a chick. Yeah.
something like that. Yeah. Um,
Yeah. Which is
ridiculous.
fantastic. I love that
She's
line.
like she makes that with that or she wants to like she wants to have sex with that werewolf guy, and he's like,
Yeah.
uh,
Oh, I forgot what I was gonna say.
but
What were you
but
saying
I'm
before?
well, okay. It's kind of like this transition in a way from like the way that the characters become like new forms, and in some
Oh
ways,
yeah.
like it sort of ties to this spirituality, if I may say so, within this film. That's kind of tied to Michael, right? Um, and in some ways, it's like the killings are now recontextualized as kind of like this, like, um,
Yeah. This one, Michael is literally magic. He's literally fucking magic. Like
instead
in
the
the
first one
first one,
humanizes him. This one like
he's
deifies
invincible.
him,
Like he
and not
can't.
not in a way that like he's like, oh, he's God, we must worship him, but more in a maltheistic way. Like it
He
deifies him.
it, like the first one does obviously the. I mean, actually, technically, if I remember correctly, it doesn't, or it kind of alludes to the recurring trope, which is that like Michael is unkillable,
Well, yeah,
and
because he's shot down, then he comes back, and then he's shot again. But then it's like,
and
whoa,
then
whoa,
he comes
wait.
back, and then he's shot in the fucking head, and he still comes back. But which is recurring throughout all the Halloween movies. But in this one, he's fucking magic. Like in like a anything he thinks becomes real. Like Michael's brain changes reality, which
Of
is
course.
amazing. He knows things that he couldn't possibly know. He knows, for example, that Laurie is his sister. How would he know that? Because his ghost mom told him, but his ghost mom is in his head. Like that's not his mother,
No, but she's not because Laurie sees her later.
but she tells him things that only she would know. So like he has this link to like the other side.
He changes the fabric of reality. There's
He
also this.
literally traverses hundreds of miles in like instance. And I have to stress, I'm not saying this in like a
Well,
cinema sins red letter media kind of way. I'm not critiquing this movie. I think this is awesome. I think this is amazing.
there's this telepathic like connection between he and
Yeah,
his
they
sister.
share a brain.
Yeah, yeah, they almost like share like this brain together, and it starts like becoming more obvious within the second movie. And there's like this scene where she freaks out because she can't process her emotions. She sees like the guy that's dressed as Frankenstein kind of like yelling like perverted things and something about a pig, and she
Yeah,
starts like that guy who is like the owner of the strip club that Michael's mom
yeah,
worked at
yeah,
before,
yeah, yeah.
and then eventually Michael kills it. But it's like she responds to this, and then suddenly Michael's like, "I'm gonna kill them now."
Yeah, or when he's eating a dead dog and she starts vomiting. Like it's like
That was a great that like
it's a very like
juxtaposition. That juxtaposition is brilliant, and I don't care if it's like blunt. it's like the way that it sounds kind of like this, like kind of like pro-vegetarian or vegan message, but the actual like implications of like why she starts like connecting it together, that like that's such like great editing, and a great example of you know, cross-cutting
I
between two different places at the same time, and kind of like merging like this thematic connection. I wouldn't say it's as good as something like the climax of Revenge of the Sith or anything like that, but it's pretty good,
it's exceptional cutting.
it's exceptional cutting, or I guess like I can think of a couple things that are a bit better, but like Apocalypse Now ending, and Godfather Battleship and kind of those things. But at the end of the day,
No, no,
this is like, as far as like a film from the 2000s, very very well edited. Like late 2000s, I think, like what 2009 also had Watchmen had some great editing too, but
it reminds me at times, and I'm sorry to go here because I know this is also kind of a meme to say, but I mean it very sincerely, that it reminds me of David Lynch at points. And when I say that, I mean that like the way it treats like
reality.
how the world is created by
Yep.
people's minds. Because let me compare this to like something like I noted like Kiyoshi Kurosawa and Birdman. So like think Birdman. Birdman, there's a lot of surreal shit, but you're led to assume it's like to some extent in the mind of Michael Keaton, right? And this also happens in like a lot of Kiyoshi Kurosawa movies, like Pulse.
Yeah.
Pulse, it's unclear just to what degree this is literal or like
Right.
metaphorical or like in the minds of characters. Now compare that to like easy shit. Like an easy one would be like say Lost Highway by Lynch, where it's like very clearly in the mind of one character, right? But compare that with Mulholland Drive, and Mulholland Drive is a little more complicated because Mulholland Drive seems to imply it's all in Naomi Watts' head, right? But you see multiple characters who never interact with each other. So it feels like more collective, like it's multiple people sharing in this thing that's happening. And that's kind of what happens
Well, it's
here
very
because
solipsistic in that way, isn't it?
I almost think it's anti-solipsistic because
Okay.
it's the opposite because it's multiple people.
Well, yeah,
It's more it's
but
this
if it's all
shared
okay, so it's like this
it's this
collective
shared
consciousness.
collective
Okay, I
thing.
gotcha.
Yeah, like I wouldn't go as far as collective unconscious only because that's a very
it's the
clear cut
force.
idea.
It's the force, right?
Yeah, it's the force. I
Hey,
wouldn't.
like, listen. In this episode of Your Cult Boyfriend, we're going to talk about Star Wars for a second. So the thing I love about like the force within like the movies, and Lucas really made this explicit in the prequels, is that it basically is montage. It is like juxtaposition of images together, and that's what connects. Like a film is connected together with the contrasting
Yeah,
images.
the montage cells and
So in
all
some
that.
ways,
Yeah,
and I think that's like, you know, I don't think like Spielberg films really got that interesting until like editing wise until like E.T. And that also has like the way, especially the frog scene, right? Um
yes, yeah. I know what you're getting at. As like film is kind of like
you need to
emblematic
like
of these processes.
if you're going to do something like that, do it like Lucas, do it like Spielberg, do it like Zombie, do it like Lynch, right? To express
The
yes,
editing implies the psychological
yes,
process at
the
play.
style and
Yes.
substance. Um
Yes.
so might as well take advantage of that. Otherwise, like the style, like as you call it, like is not really interesting. Like it may be
Yeah,
saying something,
no.
but it may be saying something shallow. So that's basically what I'm saying. Um,
Yeah, no. I see what you mean. It's definitely like the style of the film reinforces what's literally happening in the film, which again, like this is a movie in which like a serial killer and his sister are literally changing the world with their minds. And it's made clear, I think, that it's not just in their heads either. Like they're literally changing reality for other people through their minds, like, which is, I again, like, I don't necessarily think we have, I know I said Michael is magic, we don't have to literally go to Michael is magic, because I think obviously this is more like an expressive piece of art that is meant to be taken as like expressive, like it's trying to convey a feeling more than
well,
anything. So I don't want to go
in
too
that sense,
far.
it's hard to really kind of pinpoint what is and isn't like the diegetic reality. In some ways,
Yeah,
like that
that's
extended
kind of what
nightmare
I'm getting at.
sequence. Some people say, "Oh, what's the point of that extended nightmare sequence? It's just that goes on and on." Well, I think it's like it's still part of the reality.
yeah, what I'm getting at is that like even though it might not be important from like a thematic standpoint, I think it's compelling that like every single thing that happens in this movie is to some extent treated as like a diegetic reality,
Yeah.
or at least like it places a lot of value on subjectivity. Like it places an immense degree of value on subjectivity, which is I think interesting because I think for a lot of other horror movies people kind of are interested in objectivity, which is I think partly born of like a misinterpretation of Kubrick. Because like people think of like Kubrick as a very objective, cold feeling director, when The Shining is like the most objective movie ever made. But and so is Eyes Wide Shut. But like people kind of are fascinated with this notion of like film as like
Well,
objectively working
it's a
through
very like
things.
it's a very like formalist like kind of like
Yeah,
people don't really
which
read like
Zombie has
critical.
no interest in.
Well, it's because people don't really read like critical theories, so they kind of like tend to like go to like the first thing that people went to like in a relatively post-theistic world, which is the formalism. But then it's like all these things are kind of like counter that, right? Like critical theory. That's critical theory
Yeah,
before critical theory. Um,
yeah.
and
Like I
zombie kind of operates not really under formalist like it's not really
No, he operates
formalist.
entirely on his own terms.
Yeah.
He edits like a fucking 80s dude who he directs like the guys in the 80s who started out making porn films and then they got lucky making horror movies for 70 bucks a day or like 70 bucks a week. And like he takes after guys like the people that made like Faster Pussycat Kill Kill. That's his influence. That's who he looks to. He looks to like fucking Roger Corman. That's what he learned from. He didn't learn from like, I mean, he might. I think he likes Hitchcock, but you get my point. Is that
Well,
he's
it's not like the primary influence. You can see more kind of like grindhouse and like kind of
yeah,
exploitation
that's
films
what
that he
I'm
kind of
getting
takes
at.
after. And if he's taking after exploitation, then maybe it makes sense to kind of play into kind of the whole like poverty porn. I don't really like that term too much, but
Well,
like
no, that's exactly what he's doing. He does it on purpose, but it's also because he has like a morbid respect and love for them in a weird way. Because again, this is something that comes up time and again in his music and in his favorite movies, like this the quote unquote like exploitation is what people call it.
yeah.
Which supposedly sort of started with Texas Chainsaw and then spawned a lot of like
Hmm.
knockoffs.
Well, there were
But
other exploitation at any rate, but like
yeah, that's what
mainstream
I
kind of like
mean. Or
horror
like
though.
your Deliverance, I think it's called.
Yeah.
Yeah, Deliverance.
Well, there's
Like
Deliverance, but then there's also like when was Last House on the Left? That was another.
uh
Um,
late 70s, mid to late 70s, maybe. I forget
I think it
exactly.
was
Maybe earlier. Maybe I forget. It was
late.
definitely 70s. But you see the point though, is that like that kind of like morbid obsession with that crowd. And I think for a lot of people that's like something that's like offensive to go on, but Rob's like, but I love them. I love Michael, like I feel for this kid. I have empathy for this kid.
It was 1972 was Last House. So I think
1972. So there you go.
Texas
Very
Chainsaw was
early.
like 74 or something. But it's interesting though. But I think you can see traces of like different influences. But at the end of the day, I think what he's making is this kind of like
It's
this
very
it is
unique.
unique. Like despite it being a sequel to a remake, but not a remake of the original sequel, right? Is that right?
Yeah, they allude to it
There's
in a
something.
very
There's some
fun
reference. I
way.
haven't seen the original Halloween 2, so
So the original is kind of like I think of it as like a quasi Giallo movie. Like it's a movie that like has borderline no plot, no characterization, no story. It's literally just Michael hunting for an hour and a half, and it's kind of awesome. But the main it centers around a hospital on the same night that the original movie takes place. Like it literally takes place the same night, and
well,
this
oh,
is
okay, and
this
that's
is
kind of
like
what this one begins
sort
that
of
way.
parodied, sort of referenced in the
Hmm.
opening of Halloween 2. Like the opening 20 minutes of Halloween 2 correspond to the
Following the
original
White
Halloween.
Horse like introduction. Yeah, I see what
Yeah,
you're saying.
yeah. The everything with like Laurie being sent to
That
the
stuff was brutal
hospital.
too. Like the surgery like on Annie
Yeah,
and
yeah. It looks horrible. It looks gruesome. It's very much taken after like Saw and shit like that. Like the torture porn, quote unquote.
mm,
I mean, to an
so now you're
extent,
saying
it's kind
he
of
is influenced by Juan. Is that what you're saying?
nah. No, I mean, he could be. He could
I
be a
don't
fan
I
of Saw.
don't
I
I
don't know.
don't
I think it's more
see
just the style
I
of the
don't see
time.
Saw in there so much.
No, no, I think it's more just the style of the time.
Not
I
to
use
not not
Saw
to
as
not
like
to say
emblem.
anything about it. Saw is Saw is, well, it's good. Um,
I say Saw to be like emblematic of this period of time
well,
that
I'm saying not Saw, so we're not emblematic of something that it's not emblematic
fair
of.
enough. It's
Maybe Hostel, which I haven't seen.
I've talked about this on this channel before, alone. Where yeah, like this whole period from like the 2000s, basically the 90s got so self-referential that the only place forward was to go like fucking psychotic again. And then 9/11 happened and Abu Ghraib happened and suddenly we have
Well,
goddamn
there's
Hostel.
Columbine also. Um,
Yeah, Columbine, the perfect cocktail of Columbine, then 9/11, then Abu Ghraib. And then suddenly we have Hostel and shit like that.
well,
So
yeah, I
it's
mean,
very much
like,
the era.
even Saw was like a response to
Although
like, I mean, whether it's directly or not doesn't matter. It's there. It reflects the
this
culture.
This is interesting though, because this is also like Halloween 1 and 2 remakes happened around the time where the again quote unquote torture porn was kind of winding down, or not winding down, but kind of entering the mainstream again and suddenly becoming like big budget. Because before you had like I mean, I guess there was Texas Chainsaw Remake, but I'm thinking more of like Hostel, Devil's Rejects, and House of a Thousand
Well,
Corpses,
there's like you're
Saw,
talking
shit
about
like
kind of like what the 2000s were up to, right? Like they were like
yeah, but
even not even so much Saw, but also like the Saw sequels. They got gorier and gorier, and then like
yeah,
there were
but then they
hot
also got more like kind of corporate and more because think about
human
it, like
centipede.
early on you
Yeah,
had like original properties to some extent. Again, there was Texas Chainsaw Remake early on, but other than that, it was a lot of original properties about like that were like reasonably budgeted, that were just fucking psychotic. And then all of a
yeah.
sudden you have like
But
big,
then also,
you know,
do keep in
Friday
mind,
the 13th remake and shit
right?
like
Well,
that.
do keep in mind that around the same time, like I think in Japan there was like all like Takashi Miike and stuff, and then like in
Mhm.
France you have like Gaspar Noé and then like whoever made Inside and
Uh,
Martyrs,
Yeah,
right? Like
Pascal.
yeah, I
I
mean,
forget
well,
his
at any rate,
name.
yeah.
Yeah, I know who you
So
mean.
so you see kind of like this like almost like I think like it was sort of in a response. I wouldn't
But
say
but
completely, but
what's different about this though is that like aesthetically it's very similar to those things. Aesthetically it is very similar, like violence wise, like the way the violence works or the way Rob Zombie cuts. You see this in the finale of, or the semi penultimate scenes of Devil's Rejects when the family's getting tortured by the cop. And he like uses that kind of violent style. He uses that kind of editing style, but he's so disinterested in the violence at times, and he's more interested in like the characters
well,
almost.
it's
Like
almost like what I was trying to express, and maybe not successfully with my first solo video, is that like you can create kind of like these like depraved situations and kind of you can as a means to like going through the darkness in order to find the light, right?
yeah, I
Um,
agree.
and it's like
I
where
agree.
there are aspects of humanity that are beautiful and like I don't know if I should say good, but like that are like there's this humanity behind even like the most darkest situations. That's why, hey, I saw Halloween 2 like 3 times now, I think.
Yeah,
Great
same.
movie, and at least two of the times it made me cry.
Oh, this has like
You
one of
already
the
know
most
what part,
brutal.
right?
It's Annie, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, not
Yeah,
Annie,
Brad
but
Dourif.
the way the
Brad Dourif coming home and finding his daughter dead, and it cuts to footage of her as a kid with her puppy,
it's like, oh
which is like
no,
one of the
God,
most
no.
brutal,
It's like no, no,
one of the
no.
most brutal
People,
things I've ever seen.
it's so visceral, but it's transcendent, and it kind of brings this life of its
Yeah,
own. It's great.
it's
It's
where
it's
I
beautiful.
struggle with people that like really hate on Rob as like an insincere filmmaker, because I'm like, people think like he's like a gratuitous or kind of like exploitive filmmaker, or like
I mean,
bad
isn't he
taste, all of
somewhat?
that. Yeah, but I mean, like, he's a bad taste filmmaker, and I'm like, how can you say he doesn't at least give a shit when like he has scenes like that where like a father, a father finds his daughter dead, and like all he can see running through his
Well, yeah, and he
mind is
almost
pictures of
lost
her
her
as a
2 years
kid.
ago.
Yeah, and it's like he fucking cares almost too much, Rob. Like, I'm sure if he had his way, he would do that for literally every character in the movie. Like, give a little flashback of them when they were a happy 4-year-old and then cut to them getting hacked up. Like, I'm sure
Imagine
he
that.
would if he could.
It's but what he did with this is just so good.
It's brutal. It's absolutely brutal. But
If a
I say
movie can make
brutal
me
like
cry two
emotionally.
times, the movie made
What?
me cry 2 times, so that's good. I
What's the
can't think
other
of
one?
what. No,
What's the other
it made
one?
me cry. No, 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 no. I saw it twice, right? And
Oh.
so
They love hurts. Crying in the club to love hurts.
that
Yeah, it's
yeah, when that reprises, like, because it's a reprise from the first movie, so now it's like a different singer. Um, that beautiful scene. It kind of reminds me of like the ending of Pan's Labyrinth to some extent. But it's
I
kind
can
of
see
like this.
that.
It's because she like through this trauma, like almost like the sacrifice. She
Yeah, I do find
transcends reality
I
into the
think
afterlife.
what's interesting about this movie is that it kind of consistently denies easy resolution, which is, I think, another kind of struggle point for people, is that like there's no kind like, compare this. I haven't seen it, for all in all fairness. The David Gordon Green, I think his name is, Halloween from 2018, where like the whole premise is Laurie fights back, and Laurie, spent 30, 40 years, training to kill Michael one day and get her revenge. Whereas this
That's
Laurie,
just
she's like,
like
no, her life is miserable. She, one of my, like, one thing, she, like, this movie does a really good job of showing how, like, sometimes relationships just get fucked and there's no fixing them, like, in the Halloween '07, like, she has a great relationship with Annie, they're friends, and then in this they're like, they
they
can
live
barely
together,
stand to
and
be
there's
around each other,
and it's like but they live together though, and it's just
and they
like
constantly remind each other about like horrible things that
yes,
happen to
but
them,
then
and
at
they
the
can
same time
barely
they've also
bear to be
bonded.
around
So
each other.
it's like this, but I think
There's
there's
no easy answers. It's like, no, they'll never be happy around each other, but they kind of need each other, and it's like there's no resolution to that, or like answer about what's healthy or not healthy about it. It's just like, this is how it is. They're fucked. They yell at each other, but they're also the only people that kind of understand each other, and they're in pain, and that's about all that it comes to. And the same thing happens with the ending, because it's like, yeah, Lori just probably just fucking dies, and it's kind of miserable, but
right,
it doesn't like offer you any kind of closure
right.
about it. It's just, she just suffers. And I guess for some
Well,
people
yeah.
that's
Well, I think
gratuitous,
I know.
but
I think the ending is like closure enough. Like the very ending. Like,
for the audience maybe, but like, for
well, no,
Lori, like, she's
she's gone,
drunk
but
and
it's the
then gets
end of
kidnapped.
suffering, though. No, no, the death is the end of suffering, and now she transcends to the afterlife or whatever it's saying
Which,
with that white horse stuff.
I'd like to clarify, I don't think the movie is like saying like Lori should have died. Like, I don't think
I
in the
don't
movie,
know.
I don't think it's saying like that's the answer. I'm just saying, I think the movie is saying she suffered and then she died.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know if that, like, I don't think he's saying like that's the answer for her. I don't think he's saying like she could never be happy.
Well,
I
I
think
think
he's
it's
just like creating this world where that's what happens. She just dies, or she
well,
suffers and she goes to a hospital, or whatever happens to her. She just
die,
suffers and then never gets closure about it.
die.
And die, yeah, die.
I love that.
It's, I don't know, I find that respectful. I find that respectful because I find it, because it's
I
a
don't know if I
guy.
entirely agree though.
I
Um,
Well, because I think this is a rich guy, like, because Rob Zombie's wealthy. Rob Zombie's a white
yeah,
man who's
that's why it's
wealthy and runs a rock
exploitation.
band. Well, no, I'm saying like he's a rock band singer who's very wealthy, and he's a white guy. He's not going to have the answers for how like young women that have been like horrifically traumatized are going to like process their grief, or like get over it or move on. He doesn't have those answers. he's just showing the situation. Like he's just showing a situation as he perceives it, or like how he imagines it would play out. But he's not like preaching to you about what would fix it.
Well, yeah,
He's
because no, I think he's honestly saying there is no fix,
or if there is, he doesn't know what it is. I
and you're
think is
better off dead.
more so. He doesn't know what the
No, it's
answers
like
are.
I think death is the answer.
No, I don't
I
know.
don't know if that's what
That's
he's saying.
heavy.
I think that like one can conclude that though. She
I
smiled at
I
the
don't
end
know if the
as she's like in like the passageway from Earth to
well, you say that, but like
purgatory, hell, heaven.
I also don't think like there's any kind of I think this is very different from like or it's actually similar again with Lynch. It's actually kind of similar to Fire Walk with Me because Fire
I
Walk
can
with
see it.
Me is
I can see it.
like Laura finally finds some semblance of peace. Where I think it's different though is that like where Laura clearly finds peace in like finally just dying. Laurie and their names are similar. Laurie, I don't know because like I don't because Laura sees a literal angel, and I get that it's most likely like a
I
projection
think
on her part, but
no, I think
like,
Laurie also does, like with the
but
mom.
her mother is
No,
fake. Her
hey,
mother's
Michael is an angel.
my, but what I
Michael is
mean
an
is like,
angel. His mom's an
Laura,
angel. His
no,
child
his
version's an
mom's
angel.
fake. His mom is a
No,
figment of his
not.
imagination. She's a
She's
projection on
not.
his part because she
Loomis is
rejects every.
wrong.
No,
Loomis is
no, because
wrong.
she no, let me clarify. I think Michael made her real. Like,
Okay.
I think she can
Okay.
literally engage with the world and affect the world in the sense that, like, I think if she touched someone,
Create
they
your own
would feel
destiny kind
it.
of thing. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, like, I think but I think Michael created her out of, like, his image of his mother, not as his mother as she really was, but, like, how he envisions his mother is how she
Mm.
appears. And so that's why I don't think she's like the saving grace for Laurie, because this is just a projection of Michael's desires, of his desire to like reconstruct a family. And so I think all that happens to Laurie at the end is that she's Michael won. She's reunited with Michael. And whether Laurie's dead or in a hospital, she's like mentally united with Michael now. Like she's in his world, she's in his headspace. And so I think that's compared to Fire Walk with Me, where like
Mm.
Laura creates an angel for herself that finally makes her feel happy for the first time in her fucking life. Laurie is like kind of just
I can see
taken
it.
somewhere new that she can't
Yeah,
return from,
I can
united
see
with
it.
Michael.
Yeah.
Michael brings her to his world and now she can never come back, whether she's dead or in a hospital or whatever. She's
Love
like never
hurts.
coming back. Yeah, love hurts. She's never coming back. Laurie's gone. But so that's why I don't think it's like saying like death is the answer, because I don't even know if she died or not. I'm just saying like she is not Laurie anymore at the end of it. Laurie is gone. Like Michael won,
Well,
whatever he did to
I
her.
think Laurie was basically gone like
Yeah, she was gone for a long time because
for
Michael
two
fucking
years.
destroyed Laurie. And
She's
I think that goes back to like how like people just kind of hurt each other in these movies and there's no
mhm.
reason to it. Michael just wanted to rebuild his family, and to do it he killed his sister and like destroyed her life. But it's fucked. It's really fucked. But which is why it's such a sad movie.
Why it's a great movie too.
It's a
Um,
fantastic movie. And I think there's a great arc because I think the first movie is very, again, sort of conventional. I actually disagree with people who hate the second half of it. I know a lot of people who actually like Rob
no,
Zombie.
it's good.
Yeah, well, I know people who are fans of Rob Zombie, but are always like, yeah, but the second half, he's just kind of remaking Carpenter. And I'm like, how can you not view that as like
It's a
completely different?
recontextualization. That's what I
It's
liked about it.
completely recontextualized. You
He
can't.
made Carpenter's film interesting.
He took Carpenter's film and he made it a completely different movie. You
Yeah.
can't say it's similar in any way. They have no thematic overlap almost. They he took the same visuals, but it's a different movie. It's completely different. He and but then I'll say Halloween 2 is more like traditional Rob Zombie. Halloween '07 is kind of different. It's more kind of studio Rob Zombie. Halloween 2 is where he goes like a House of a Thousand Corpses mode. And he's like, yeah, three girls, they dress as Rocky Horror characters and go to a Halloween concert, and we'll have 5 minutes of a Halloween band playing and neon
Good.
lights and
Well,
crazy
he
cutting
really
and
like
magic light horses.
the aesthetic of those movies is so good.
Yeah,
Um,
this is where he goes like full blast Rob Zombie music video
the
mode.
surrealism, like some of the surreal images of like these pumpkin like ghost things. It's like
I love that shit. Yeah,
I don't know what he was even doing, but I like it. I think
I have absolutely no idea. Although we
well,
talked
like,
about how I like Michael is like doing ritual murders in this one, so I think that's
yeah,
kind of the
it's kind of like
evocation
making
there.
Halloween like kind of like this own spiritual thing, right?
Yeah, like he's
Because this is a
like
spiritual
he's
movie
a
in some
cult,
ways.
like he's doing like cult murders
Mm,
to like deities that aren't even fucking like that he made up.
right.
Like he made up these deities to murder for and shit like that, and they're gonna reunite him with his family. It's fascinating. It's really fascinating. It's why I'm kind of like more like Jung mode on this than like Freud mode, but all the same, like
Yeah, but it's so Freudian.
yeah. Again, I think that's more because Rob isn't really familiar with Jung, but and to be fair, most of that for me is kind of
I don't know
superficial.
how
Like
familiar he is with Freud either. Yeah, I think he just like
I
does
mean,
the basic Oedipal complex, which is fine because like
we
unless
say
you're
that I think anyone who is like fluent in horror movies kind of knows Freud.
yeah, I mean like
Like
that's
if
what
you've watched
Psycho
Dario
is.
Argento, if you
Yeah,
watch Dario Argento, I think you know Freud. But even in like nuanced ways, even ways that I think
well,
people don't realize, like kind of the mechanics of like Freudian development and
he
shit
may not
like
even be
that.
cognizant of all of it also, but
Yeah, yeah.
um one thing that I was curious about that we had a discussion about, and I looked it up, and it doesn't seem like I can really find like an answer. I haven't like watched any commentaries or anything like that, so maybe there is an answer out there. Um, how do you interpret the part for the audience in Halloween 2 where he's butchering Annie and his and like the ghost of his mom or whatever tells the child version of Michael, now go have fun with her. How do
I
you interpret
I I
that?
still I still take that to be mostly just like he enjoys murdering. I suppose it can have like a sexual connotation, but I don't think it was
See, that's
literally like I don't think that's what happened. I don't think what Michael
so
did is what you think he did, but like
I
I think
interpreted it differently depending on when I watched it. Because first I thought it was just murder, and then I thought, oh, this is rape, and now I'm not so sure.
well, I say it mostly because I think the distinction is kind of negligible in a slasher in which like the weapon is already so
The
like I think
phallus.
he literally just like stabbed her with a knife, but I think that's supposed to
Well,
be
but any
emblematic of the
right,
act.
so he
So
brutalized
yeah,
her
I think
over and
it's
over again,
supposed to,
and she's actually still alive for at least for a little bit, like towards the end. When
which
Laurie
happens in
sees
both movies, is that she
right,
actually
it
survives,
happens
but then
again
she
though,
dies.
and in some ways I think it's supposed to be like the time she dies, and I think it's like whether it's like actually supposed to be like she's supposed to be
Sexual
sexually
or not.
violated or not,
Yeah.
she still is, right?
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I think it carries that connotation. I think that's pretty clear. I haven't seen many people talk about it. I never like interpreted it at least literally that way.
Yeah, but
But
I guess I took it
also because
literal. Well, it's
I
hard to
think
take
like
it
in
literally because this is okay, because like it's a ghost mom
I know,
doesn't
but
exist telling a ghost son that doesn't exist to do something, and it's not even that kid that's doing it. It's this god
yeah,
thing.
I say that also because I think like again, Michael is kind of characterized as being like eternally a child and incapable of
Mm,
like maturing. And so I think
yes,
he uses like murdering as a
as a
stand-in
supplement
as a
in some ways.
supplement for these
Yeah,
things that he doesn't really get. So like that's what I think it is. I will say I also love that like she constantly talks to child Michael, not to big Michael. I love that.
yes,
I think that's really clever. I thought that was really really clever directing on his part, or like a really clever decision. Um, it's super interesting. It's almost like he's like a non-entity, like he's just a nothingness that's just kind of
the
there. He's like a
yeah.
Michael's like a
So
ghost. He's like a
right.
ghost that just
Well,
refuses to die.
so
I think
that
you could almost like interpret him as having indeed died at the end of Halloween '07, and he just like he just, his like spirit
His
lingers. If
mission
you,
carries on, right?
yeah,
Okay. Another on that note, another question that I have about this movie, and I kind of want to get your thoughts, at least at voice, because I know in the theatrical cut of the Halloween 2, like it takes place just 1 year later, but it makes way more sense in
yeah,
the film for it to take place 2 years later. Because
yeah.
it's some time to process, and now she knows that like kind of like Halloween as a holiday now triggers her, right?
You want to
Um,
know where Michael was?
yeah, where was Michael within that year though? Because he
I
escaped
don't
before
know.
that.
I don't know.
Was
Regaining
it
his
not until
power.
like Loomis was published in the book that he's like, oh, that is Laurie? That's kind of how I took it, but I don't know.
Well, I think part of it, I think that is part of it, because I think what I think, again, like we've already talked about, like Halloween 2, it's a movie in which like the human mind creates reality, and then the reality creates the human mind, and they kind of reverberate back off each other. So I think the fact that like Laurie was about to be confronted with this thing about her life created Michael, but then also Michael created that, and it's like they just all these things just like cause each other to happen in like perfect synchronicity. I think I don't know if there's like a literal story of Michael hiding in an alleyway for
Well,
2 years eating
do keep
rats,
this in
but
mind. Do keep this in mind. In the first movie, like, um, his mom stayed alive for another year before she committed suicide, and then she gave
yeah,
up on everything. So there's a
because
so
Michael committed
there was a
murder.
year between the way he killed. There was a year before he killed somebody again. Um,
Yeah, in
but
the
this one,
hospital,
but now
the
it's like two
nurse.
years.
Yeah,
So I'm trying to make sense of that. But at any rate, like I don't dwell on it too much. And another thing that kind of caught me off guard watching these back to back is
I
that
think it's I think it's literally in context a matter of like if Loomis had never written the book,
yeah,
or if Laurie had, say, like moved on somehow,
I think
like,
had he
which I
not,
think is
yes,
impossible. But like if,
just
like,
one day
say
at a time.
theoretically she, yeah, like say theoretically in some fantasy land, Laurie actually just like was able to like get closure and move on with her life,
But
Michael
it's
never would have
writing
come
that
back.
book. It's writing that book that kind of like made it like this
Yeah,
reality.
it's like he came back because he had to come back, and he had
Yeah.
to come back because Laurie couldn't move on.
Yep.
And if she could, then he wouldn't have come back. But I think it's literally just like, again, like this, like their brains are creating reality. He comes back because he has to be back, but he's also
Comes back,
real.
yeah. And also it's like the book kind of like like
Which,
makes it a
yeah,
reality
yeah,
again. And
very,
kind of like
very
the
urgent.
legacy of this serial killer lives on through this literature, right? Um
Yeah, and I want to clarify, like I think this is distinct from like movies where like the happenings like kind of reflect feelings and like like things they're going through emotionally, because I think Michael literally physically came back to the world because his sister could not move on. And I
yeah,
think like real people died because like he came back because of that. So like which is I think a fascinating thing about this movie that is very unique and
yeah,
sets it apart from other movies. And it's fascinating about this movie. It's because it's a kind of like subjectivity, like extreme radical subjectivity
yeah,
that you don't really see often. You really
right.
don't see it often. Um, which is why I'm harping on it so much. But I think it's like the most fascinating thing about this movie, and I think it only happened through pure luck. Like it's astonishing this movie
Well,
got
I don't know.
made.
I think Zombie's quite aware of what he's doing for the most part, and it's like I think he's just a
Oh,
good
I agree.
filmmaker, you
I
know?
think he's a good filmmaker, and he's also a guy who like speaks in music video language, so it makes sense.
Yeah, I can see that. Any other thoughts?
God, I don't know. What else haven't we talked about these movies?
I think we kind of covered like the basic idea here. I mean, I think the first one, the second one's better than the first one. The first one's
Yeah, I
quite good
agree.
though.
The first one, like I
Including the
said,
second half.
I had to
Uh,
skip through parts. It was really bumming me out. Like it was making me feel like
yeah,
shit.
but I think that there may be some negatives to that, like as far as like what like his
Oh yeah.
sensitivities or lack thereof.
Well, this
Um,
is why like a zombie is like a director where I'm like, I don't think everyone should watch him because I don't
yeah,
think everyone is like emotionally prepared for that. You
Well,
know, like there are people who have been through like horrible traumatic things, and I think there are some people out there who might say like, you should watch Halloween 2. It might be cathartic for you. I'm like, I wouldn't do that for everyone, because maybe they'll
well,
watch
yeah,
Halloween
because
2
people have different
and it'll be
experiences, and I think that that's what we need to kind of be aware of. And people are sensitive to different things. It's okay not to be Santa, not to like be sanitized to certain things, or kind of like
yeah,
or do sense or whatever the word. Yeah, you know what I'm saying though. Like,
yeah,
so I
yeah, yeah.
think, and I think that that's important. And like, and honestly, like even people that are, people could probably find other reasons not to like these movies, and that's fine. But between you and I and everybody on this channel, it's just nothing but love for
Everyone
Rob.
involved with
Yep.
this channel that we will not name that you are
Yeah.
watching right
Rob.
now.
Rob's like everybody for this.
Robert J. Zombie fan club.
There's nothing but love here. All right.
Yeah, there's nothing but love and
Your cult
on this
boyfriend.
channel.
All right. Thanks for
Bye.
watching.